Americas. So I'm honored to be part of this conference, which explores the idea of Quaker furniture throughout Anglo-North America. This has been an interest to scholars going back to the 1940s and 1950s, Frederick Toll's among them. And more recently, there have been studies focused on specific regions of the Americas. And I think this conference is fantastic because it takes a holistic view, exactly how Robert laid out so well on the map, and trying to look at the exchange between all these different regions and the mechanisms of exchange. So for my part, I'm going to focus on colonial Rhode Island and the development of the Townsend and Goddard workshops of Newport specifically. Based in the Quaker faith and in tightly interconnected bonds of family and business, their workshops led the furniture making trades in Newport and later in Providence for generations during the 18th and early 19th centuries. From the earliest cabinet makers like Job and Christopher Townsend, the dynasty grew to include such craftsmen as John Townsend, Edmund Townsend, and the illustrious John Goddard. Through patronage networks, apprenticeships, and journeymen who trained in their shops, and the venture cargo trade, their style became widely influential around the Narragansett Bay, in neighboring colonies like Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth, in Canada, and also in the South. So tonight I'm going to focus on some of the major cabinet makers that were part of this tightly interconnected group of families and look at some of the most important early documented pieces. So a number of years ago, the legendary Newport antiquarian and historian Ralph Carpenter wrote an article, and he used the term Quaker Baroque to describe furniture made in Rhode Island, responding both to the deeply conservative nature of the style of Rhode Island furniture, but also the meticulous, you might even say obsessive, level of craftsmanship. So a lot of the objects in my talk tonight were featured in a wonderful exhibition that was at the Yale University Art Gallery this past fall that was organized by the incomparable Patricia Kane. I had the good fortune of working with Pat on this project beginning about 16 years ago when I was a student at Yale. And in the early days, it was just Pat and myself, and we did what all the good people at MESDA did. We hit the archives first, and we focused on all of the documentary evidence in Rhode Island that had really not been gone through by historians, and certainly not furniture historians. And I took the early part of the project, the first 100 years of the colony between 1636 and 1740, and Pat took the rest from 1740 to 1800. And we started the project with about 350 names of furniture makers who were associated with Rhode Island, mostly Newport. And during the course of this research, we discovered 1,500 furniture makers who were working throughout the colony. And while the Townsends and Goddards, they were still at the top of this pyramid, but it was a much larger pyramid, and it made their accomplishments even more impressive. So I want to begin with a quick word about Rhode Island. The first English settlers came to the Narragansett Bay region in 1636. Most of them were religious dissidents who were fleeing religious persecution in neighboring Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colonies. And Rhode Island did start with a royal charter. It was simply, for the first few decades, a loose conglomeration of towns. Newport and Portsmouth on Aquidneck Island in the southern part of that map, and in the northern part of the map, Warwick on the western side of the Narragansett Bay, and Providence in the northern section. It was not until 1663 that Rhode Island was issued a royal charter and became officially the colony of Rhode Island and the Providence plantations. And this charter from Charles II called for a, quote, lively experiment in religious freedom. It says that no person residing in the colony could be molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for any differences in opinion in matters of religion. Newport grows to become the most important early town in the colony, and you can see it's the group of red right here on the left side here. They had amazing access to the Atlantic and the coastwise shipping trade. They also had access to the rich, verdant agricultural hinterlands, especially on the western side of the colony, and it made Newport a really thriving place early on. So the Anglican cleric George Berkeley, who arrived in Newport in 1729, called it the most thriving, flourishing place in all America for its bigness. In matters of religion, Berkeley also said at the same time, he described the inhabitants of being of a mixed kind, consisting of many sects and subdivisions of sects. Here are 4 sorts of Anabaptists, besides Presbyterians, Quakers, Independents, and many of no profession at all. Notwithstanding so many differences, there are fewer quarrels about religion than elsewhere, the people living peaceably with their neighbors of whatsoever persuasion. They all agree on one point, he said, that the Church of England is the second best. So by 1700, half of the population of Newport were Quakers, and the Quaker faith and people of Quaker persuasion came to dominate the politics, society in Rhode Island, and especially the built environment. And I would say all of Rhode Island, but especially Newport, is pervaded by this kind of sense of plainness that you see, not only in the furniture making, but also in the built environment, in the buildings, and the agricultural landscapes. So this is an overmantel painting of Newport as it appeared around 1740. You can see it's a fairly bustling city. There was probably about 4,000 people living in Newport in this period. You'll see in the back there are 4 large churches. There's the First Baptist Church, the Sabbatarian Meeting House, and there's the Anglican Trinity Church, which was described as being pewed well, but not beautified. I don't know what that means exactly. Had good pews, apparently. They quickly replaced that church in 1725. But also on the left side of this image is the Great Friends Meeting House, and it's the building right here that dominates the skyline. The first Quaker meeting house was actually built in the style of a congregational meeting house with a tall central tower and had a square plan. That building was changed over time, and this is what the Quaker meeting house looks like today in Newport. It was, for most of its history, one of the largest buildings in New England, and it was added onto, beginning with the central core. Obviously, the tower was removed, and it was made a much more rectangular building, not square anymore, and a women's meeting was added on the left side of the image. And initially, there were about 500 Quakers who would meet annually in Newport around 1700 to 1705. And in 1750, the meeting house was greatly expanded, and there were about 5,000 Quakers that would come for the yearly meeting in Newport. And it attracted Quakers from all over southern New England and elsewhere. This is an image from the early 19th century, kind of showing the throngs of Quakers who came. So going back to the map briefly, going back to the painting, I want you to focus your attention on this part of the northern section of Newport that's very close to the Quaker meeting house. This was land that was known as Easton's Point, and it was given to the Quaker Easton family in the 17th century. They were among the first residents of Newport. And Samuel Easton, the last Quaker owner of the land, bequeathed the land to the Quaker meeting. And in the early 18th century, the Quaker meeting started to sell off this land, and they created a neighborhood that just carved out of virtually nothing that was here before. This is the section of Newport that's known as Easton's Point, or simply as the Point. And you can see this little spit of land that comes out right in the northern section of the harbor. And this is the land that the Quaker meeting laid out and then started to sell off. And this became the major center for Quakers and also Quaker furniture makers. And you'll notice a little bit of a difference in the town planning. You know, like most New England towns, Newport was laid out with streets radiating in every direction. And you can see that in the other part of the city. But you'll notice the strict rectangular grid that is laid down in the point. This is very advanced modern urban planning for the early 18th century. And they model it after Quaker Philadelphia. And the streets are named, as they are in Philadelphia, after trees. In Newport, there's elm, poplar, willow, walnut, chestnut, cherry, and pine. And the street along the water was originally Water Street, and then going northward, you start to see numbers in the cross streets. So this became a major center for Quaker development. There were a lot of investments by Quakers in this part of town, and I found in part of my research the early map of from the Quaker meeting showing the distribution of land to various people. And beginning in the 17 teens, shipwrights moved in very early, and they tended to occupy the plots along the water. Those are the blue squares or rectangles along the water, which makes sense, they're shipwrights. And then in the following decades, furniture makers start moving in. Christopher Townsend buys land in 1724. Job Townsend, his brother, buys land the same year, 1724. And also Daniel Goddard, a shipwright who was the father of John Goddard. And so this moment, right in the mid-1720s, is critical for understanding the development. And when making this map, I only focused on 1715 to 1740, just the early period, but you can see how the shipwrights clustered along the water and the furniture makers clustered a block or two inland. And there's one street that was originally called Shipwright Street. It's the one that runs right here, but now is called Bridge Street because they installed a bridge here. And just on the other side of the bridge was the home of William Claggett, the great Newport clockmaker. So you can see there's a great concentration here. Christopher Townsend's property is right here. His brother John later bought land here. Son John bought land here, and brother Job had land here. So the Townsends really occupied quite a bit of property on Bridge Street during the course of the 18th century. Christopher Townsend's house and shop still survive on the point. They were built probably by Christopher Townsend himself sometime after 1725. And you'll see the shop on the right part of the image. It's one of the very few surviving shops from the 18th century, certainly in New England. There's two surviving in Newport now, Christopher Townsend's shop and the John Stevens stone carving shop, which was founded in 1705 and still occupies the same site and building, and there's still a stone carving shop. And it's in this pretty modest structure that Christopher Townsend started making furniture as elaborate as this. This is a great desk and bookcase that was discovered in the late 90s and sold for over $8 million, made and signed by Christopher Townsend probably in the second half of the 1740s. It's distinguished because it has not only fine imported woods, but also silver hardware, top to bottom, including these loopers in the shape of birds that pull out to support the lid of the desk when it opens. Samuel Casey also was from Newport and was part of the community of silversmiths that originally was on the point. There were two other silversmiths, Isaac Anthony and Samuel Vernon, who worked there on the point. So there's these craftsmanship connections really enhance the furniture that's made there. And the desk sold for $8 million, but I did find this quote from Christopher Townsend to another Quaker, Abraham Redwood, written just a little bit before in 1738. And he writes to Redwood, he says, "Brother Job," meaning his brother Job Townsend, "also sold one, a desk and bookcase, to our collector for 59 pounds. I mention this that thou may know that I have not imposed upon thee." This is something that Robert mentioned, but this idea of fair dealings was very important to Quakers. John Townsend also built a grand house on the point. This was what the house looked like in the late 19th century. You could see how big it is. It was one of the biggest houses in the city, if you can believe it, and it sat right next to a very large merchant house that survives today as the Hunter House, one of the most elaborate 18th century structures that still stands in Newport, and it's equal in size to the Hunter House. John Goddard was an incredibly successful craftsman. He was always taxed at the highest level of craftsmen in the city in the 1760s and 1770s. And you can see the shop protruding from the back, and he's right on the water, which is interesting. He's right on the row where all the shipwrights were. That house has since been moved and now occupies a different plot of land on the point. And one of the earliest pieces made by John Goddard that survives and is documented is this desk from 1745. And it has, it's inscribed on the inside on a label made by John Goddard of Newport on Rhode Island in New England in the year of our Lord, 1745. And this very precise locating of this desk seems to indicate that it was probably intended for the shipping trade or the venture cargo trade, which is beginning in the 1740s. Many Newport craftsmen were involved in making things that would be loaded on ships and would sail up and down the eastern seaboard and into the Caribbean. John Townsend, another great craftsman. He's the son of Christopher Townsend. And this piece came on the market, again, a new discovery just a few years ago. And it sold for, I think, over $3 million. It's dated 1756, and it's inscribed, made by John Townsend, Newport. And there are lots of inscriptions on the inside of it. On one of the drawers, there's a list of Townsend's kind of compatriots who were with him on one day when he was in the shop. And he says that they're on their way to, they're to ride the next Wednesday. And he lists their names: William Richardson, Joseph Robinson, Edward Wanton, and John Townsend. And probably they were going to deliver this piece to the patron in 1756. And all of those four guys were Quakers, and they all came from affluent families, and they all lived on the Point. So it took me years to figure this out. It's very complicated, the interrelationships between the different Townsend and Goddard family members. But starting at the kind of the second line, we see Job Townsend Sr. and Christopher Townsend. They were the sons of Solomon Townsend, who had come to Newport in 1707 and apprenticed his children, probably in Newport. Christopher Townsend was the father of John Townsend and Jonathan, who were both furniture makers. And Job Townsend was the son of Job Townsend Jr., Edmund Townsend, and Thomas Townsend, all who were furniture makers. And then Job Townsend marries two of his daughters off to Goddards, John Goddard and James Goddard, who were married in 1746 and 1751, another prominent Quaker family in the town. And so in total, over 4 generations, there are 16 furniture makers who belong to either the Townsend or the Goddard families, and some of them intermarried. Others were merchants who helped the family business, and this created an incredible dynasty of craftsmen during the course of the 18th century. In 1761, John Goddard made this desk and bookcase, a 6-shell desk and bookcase, and we see the kind of, I wouldn't say the birth of, but the kind of a great style that reaches its greatest height with John Goddard, the block and shell, which is the combination of the typical Boston block front with carved, incised, and convex shells. And this particular piece, again, is littered with inscriptions on the inside, and several of them say, made by John Goddard, 1761, and repaired by Thomas Goddard, his son, in 1813. So just, I wanted to show this as kind of a multi-generational piece of furniture that is made by one person and continues to be worked on by members of the family. And it was probably true that these shops were very complex. John Goddard had 5 workbenches in his shop at the time of his death, which is a fairly decent-sized shop for this period. We don't know of many journeymen who worked in John Goddard's shop, but most of his sons did, and they had 16 children. John Goddard, I think 4 of them become furniture makers, and he was using this free labor for running his shop, whereas other cabinet makers were bringing in journeymen and other people. And I wanted to show 2 images of the shells, and these are located on the fall front of the desk and bookcase, very prominently on the fall front. And you'll notice how different they are. The one on the left is the concave shell in the center, and the one on the right is the convex shell. And the convex shells are added later. They're carved separately, and they're added. For those of you who saw some of the carving demonstration this afternoon, you might have talked about this. And so the center shell is integral to the front of the fall front of the desk and bookcase, whereas the other shells are added. And I just wonder whether they look so different from each other. I wonder whether the carved shells were made by different craftsmen in the shop, and they were combined together. And we see this kind of thing playing out over several pieces of furniture, but this is one of the most important of them. And I'm not sure if it was a bad day in the shop, but more likely it's that we're seeing multiple hands at work on the same piece. This is another work by John Goddard. It's dated to 1763. It was sold to a Quaker, Moses Brown, who was among the four Brown brothers who were important merchants in the city of Providence and became very, very important patrons of John Goddard. And this one is mentioned in a letter from John Goddard to Moses Brown in 1763. I did a search of known Quaker patrons of this furniture. There weren't that many, as what you'd expect, and that may be just a simple matter of that documented pieces don't survive, and they don't tell us the full story. But I did pull up a few pieces, and in addition to the scallop table that was made for Quaker Moses Brown, there's also this very early piece that was probably made by both Christopher Townsend and John Townsend in the early 1750s, right at the end of John Townsend's apprenticeship with his father. And it was made reportedly for Governor Gideon Wanton of Newport, who was a Quaker. There's another high chest at the Philadelphia Museum of Art that was made for the neighbors of John Goddard, Thomas Robinson and Sarah Richardson, who were both Quakers. So this very plain style develops in Newport, and it's very different than what other parts of the early Anglo colonies are doing. And I just compare a great desk and bookcase, a great high chest from the Philadelphia Museum, kind of the epitome of the Rococo style, that just does not sink in at all in Newport. They developed this early style that's based on Baroque architecture. The carved shell comes right out of Baroque architecture. Very, very simple, straightforward construction, and they stick with it for generations throughout the end of the 18th century. And it's just a very interesting comparison, putting these two side by side. And the piece on the right was also made by John Townsend. It's signed by John Townsend of Newport, dated 1759, which would make it among his earlier pieces. And it has a very simple carved shell with a fleur-de-lis in the center. So in addition to the very plain style of these pieces, we also see a very kind of old-fashioned construction that they adhere to in both of the Goddard and Townsend, the workshops. And one of the aspects of the construction is the way the legs are attached to the case. And scholars in the past have described these as detachable legs that might have been used for shipping purposes, because you could ship a piece in a smaller container if the legs weren't on it. That's probably not the case. But I'll show you the differences between this kind of construction and a more typical construction that you'd see, let's say, in Massachusetts or other colonies. In more typical construction, the leg is full height all the way to the top of the case, and the sides and the front are tenoned into the leg. But in Newport construction, what they basically do is build a box that forms the lower case, and then they put these legs up into it and glue them in place with glue blocks. It's kind of a practical solution, and it's the same kind of construction that you typically see in earlier furniture from the first half of the 18th century. So these legs of this William & Mary high chest are turned separately on a lathe and just inserted into the case and glued in place. And again, kind of an old-fashioned technique that's not used in other regions, but they stick with it in Newport. Another aspect of the construction are the way the drawers are made, and for those of you who attended Ben and Matt Hobbs' session today looking at the Thomas White desk, you'll see this similar kind of construction where the drawer bottom is seen through the sides all the way to the ends of the sides. And then on the bottom, they place these little thin strips or runners that could be easily replaced when they're worn out. And this kind of construction for drawers is, again, a very old-fashioned way of doing things. This is an image of an English drawer construction from around, they say, 1715 to 1730, where you can see the bottom showing through the sides, and then these little simple drawer runners that are applied to the underside. So again, it worked for them, and they stuck with it. This is another piece that was made by John Goddard for the Brown family, not for Moses Brown, but for his brother John Brown, and it's dated in a receipt from October 1760, a beautiful roundabout chair. And I wanted to show this object because there's another contradiction that I discovered in Newport that relates to Quakerism, and that is the owning of slaves and the selling of furniture to slaveholders. And the Browns were among the biggest slave traders in all of America in this period. They were based in Providence. There were four brothers. And it's interesting just to think about slavery in Newport, and I started to do some research into it. And in fact, John Goddard owned a slave by the 1760s. The relation Edwin Townsend owned 3 slaves, as did John Townsend, who owned 3 slaves in the 1760s and the 1770s. Now, about a third of the households in Newport owned slaves. They're Africans and Native Americans made up about a quarter of the population of Newport early in the 18th century and continued maybe slightly less throughout the course of the 18th century, probably down to 11 or 12%. But there were many slaves who were working in craft shops. We have evidence of other craftsmen working on the point, Isaac Anthony and Samuel Vernon, 2 goldsmiths who owned slaves that were actively working in the craft of goldsmithing. There was also a stonecutter who worked for the John Stevens shop that I mentioned earlier that was founded in 1705. And there was an African slave who worked for William Stevens making gravestones, and some of his gravestones survive and can be attributed. So going back to this desk and bookcase again, made for probably the Potter family in South Kingston on the western side of the Narragansett Bay. John Potter was a very wealthy landholder and a major slave owner, and he was also a Quaker. And he, you can see in this overmantel painting that came out of the house, there's an African slave serving tea. And it's just interesting to think about Quakers, although in the 1780s they lead the abolitionist movement in Newport and Rhode Island more generally. A little bit earlier, they made up a big share of the slaveholders in Rhode Island. And this history has not really been recognized, certainly not in New England. So this style that is developed by the Goddards and the Townsends quickly spreads to other regions throughout America. And I show, again, the desk and bookcase by John Goddard. And I'll show another desk and bookcase that had long been attributed to John Goddard, but during the course of the research for the Rhode Island exhibition at Yale, Pat Kane made an interesting discovery that in construction it's very different than many of the other desk and bookcases that we know were made in Newport. This piece was not made in Newport. It was not made even by a Townsend or Goddard. It was made by this man named Daniel Spencer, who was the nephew of John Goddard and likely trained in John Goddard's workshop, but then in the 1770s leaves Newport and he goes to Dartmouth, Massachusetts, spends only a year there after setting himself up as a cabinet maker, and then he moves to Providence. And he takes advantage of John Goddard's connections with the Brown family, and he starts making quite elaborate furniture, as you can see, for members of the Brown family. This is the desk and bookcase that was owned by John Brown in the Brown house in Providence. That was probably made, we dated a little bit earlier, but given its extraordinary height, it might have been made for John Goddard's, for John Brown's residence that he built in 1788, which is one of the biggest buildings in Providence in its era. So what led to this discovery were marking systems on the insides of this piece and related pieces. There's a desk and bookcase in a private collection that is documented to Daniel Spencer, a person that we didn't really know much about when we started this project, but we had over time amassed quite a bit of evidence about his history. And you can see there's on one drawer, there's the numeral 1 that appears in a very specific location on the drawers. And all of the pieces that have now been attributed to Daniel Spencer all share this characteristic. And you'll notice the difference in the carved shells from typical John Goddard work that you see in the left and the Spencer piece on the right that was made in Providence. And the inside of the shell in particular tends to be much wider than you see in Newport construction. But there's other easier giveaways, which is primarily the pediment. You'll notice how plain the pediment of a typical Newport desk and bookcase is on the left side, and on the right, the Daniel Spencer desk and bookcase, with those raised panels in the pediment, also the addition of rosettes. We're fortunate enough at the MFA in Boston to have two of these, both of which have been attributed to the Goddards, and both to Newport. But one of them on the right is Newport, probably, and it was owned by the Helm family of South Kingston early on. But the piece on the left was not made in Newport. It was made in Providence. And it has a history of being found in Providence, and it descended through a family and then was sold to the Carolicks, who gave it to the MFA. And we can't now attribute this piece to Daniel Spencer, but probably another craftsman who was working in Providence in the period. So you can see that kind of the style begins to spread northward into Providence, and Providence takes over as the predominant city in Rhode Island after the Revolution. There's another piece that was made by Daniel Spencer, also in Providence, that's owned by the Chipstone Foundation, with very similar carved shells and similar marking systems. Daniel's younger brother, Thomas, was also a furniture maker and also likely trained in the shop of John Goddard, and he moves after his apprenticeship to East Greenwich, Rhode Island, on the western side of the Narragansett, and he sets himself up as a furniture maker, and this piece is documented to 1775 based on a receipt and a sale to General Nathaniel Greene. This is a piece that was made in Massachusetts, probably in New Bedford, Massachusetts, by Cornelius Allen and the shop of Ebenezer Allen Jr., who were the nephews of John Goddard and may have trained with John Goddard in Newport, but then left and went to Massachusetts and started making furniture very much in the style of what they had learned. And they were both Quaker furniture makers. There's another piece by one of Goddard's children, Daniel, who became an important furniture maker. And after the Revolution, when Newport is in really tough shape, because Newport had been occupied by the British during the Revolution, Daniel and his two brothers, Job and Henry, leave Rhode Island and they go to Nova Scotia. And they move there in 1784, and he's listed by 1786 as a furniture maker, as are his two brothers. And this piece, which actually was found in Nova Scotia by a dealer, is actually signed by Daniel Goddard. On the back of the drawer it says, Daniel Goddard, his draw. And the drawer construction is very unusual, and the carving on the front of the drawer, as you can clearly see, is very different than most Newport work. And I'll also point your attention, it might be a little hard to see in the slide, but there's this gadrooning along the skirt, which is atypical for Newport work. And there's also carving on the feet, which is very, very unusual for Newport work. You never see that on case furniture. But keep that in mind, because we're going to see this in a second, in the great Thomas White desk that's here at MESDA, and that Matt and Ben told us about earlier today. And that has similar kind of floral carving on the bracket feet, and but it has a very typical interior based on the very standard Newport desks. And through Matt Hobbs, my wonderful classmate at Winterthur, through his thesis research, he discovered documentation of Thomas White in Rhode Island in the 1750s. And in fact, Thomas White, who was a Quaker, must have been friends with the Townsend and Goddard families, because he witnesses a marriage between James Goddard and Susanna Townsend in 1751. And this is one of the documents that shows Thomas White as a witness to this marriage, along with many other Quakers from town, Samuel Easton, members of the Coddington family, other Townsend and Goddard furniture makers. And so this one key marriage, along with John Goddard's marriage into the Townsend family a few years earlier, really solidify these two family networks. So I want to end with another interesting new discovery. So our friend, Daniel Spencer, although he finds early success in Providence, and he's making furniture for basically the wealthiest people in town, and he makes some extravagant pieces. He runs into money troubles, and in the 1770s and the 1780s, he's taken to court quite often for not paying his debts, and in 1785, he's actually thrown in prison for not paying his debts. And in the early 1790s, he leaves Providence, and he goes to Kentucky. He goes to Lexington, Kentucky, which was at the time a boon town, with a lot of land being distributed, a lot of wealth being generated. And I don't know, I mean, certainly Daniel is leaving his problems in Rhode Island. And it's interesting that he comes to Kentucky in the 1790s, and he works as a furniture maker in Lexington from 1790 until his death in 1796. And there are these two clocks and some other pieces that might have been made by Daniel Spencer. One on the left is owned in a private collection that has a history in Lexington going back to the early 19th century, and it has Newport characteristics. Notice those rosettes at the end of the scrolled pediment. Notice the Newport-style finials, which are believed to be original in this clock, and there's some other features as well. It has bracket feet. And there's a clock with works by Thomas Walker, Fredericksburg, Virginia, clockmaker, in a tall case clock at Colonial Williamsburg that shares some of the same features. The finials are thought to be replaced. So to think about Daniel Spencer maybe moving to Kentucky and continuing this style of work, but for a local audience, is really fascinating. And it shows you the continued spread of the Rhode Island style outside of the colony. So 18th century Newport was composed of individuals moving through a series of intersecting circles of civic, religious, fraternal, trade, and familial groups. Each of these communal structures also functioned to a degree as an economic unit, enabling and encouraging the exchange of goods, information, and services. The Townsend and Goddard workshops were closed systems. They didn't let many outsiders in. They intermarried with other Quakers. Most of the furniture makers who served as apprentices or journeymen were also Quakers, mostly family members. And it's very unlike other systems of production that you see developing in Rhode Island at the same time. Like John Cahoon, for example, was a much more modern furniture maker. And he's involving a lot of journeymen and apprentices coming from all directions. So this is just a little taste of what's going on in Newport, and I hope that it sets the stage for what you're going to hear about tomorrow, looking at Philadelphia and looking at the South. Thank you so much.